Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Craig from Acid Horizon, and I just want to say thanks to everybody who supported us through this little ordeal that we're going through at the moment. What's the ordeal? Well, there's a link in the show notes. And the many new patrons who have decided to subscribe and are participating in our reading groups. Just a big thank you to everybody. Another thing that keeps the podcast going is a little design shop I created called Crit Drip, where you can purchase philosophy-inspired gifts designed by me. Don't want to buy anything new? Totally understandable. If you still want to support the podcast, becoming a patron is really the best way. Our newest Hegel reading group is just leaving the port. There's still time to jump on, and we have new reading groups on the way. We would love to see you there. Just go to the show notes and click on any of the links to any of the things that I talked about just now. Today, we have a good friend of mine on the show, Nicolas de Warren, a Penn State University professor who has an excellent paper on the topic of the anarchist imaginary. Let's hop in and listen. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, we're joined by Nicolas de Warren, a philosopher with whom I've had the privilege of collaborating on a public philosophy series in the community surrounding Penn State University in Pennsylvania, as well as working together to broadcast last year's Time, Waste, Extinction workshop, an interdisciplinary workshop which brought us together with various scholars at the university. Nicolas' work spans phenomenology, critical theory, and the politics of time, and today we're discussing his latest paper, Anarchism, The Shock from Elsewhere, Glissant and Levinas, a piece that may eventually take shape as a book, as I understand. In this work, he explores the anarchist imaginary as a space of irreducible alterity, engaging Edouard Glissant's right to opacity and Emmanuel Levinas' ethics of the other to rethink political solidarity, language, and resistance beyond hegemonic structures. Alongside this, he develops an ethics of reading, a mode of interpretation that resists mastery, avoids subsuming thinkers into ideological programs, and keeps philosophical discourse open to its own errancy. In doing so, Nicolas challenges us to see anarchism not only as a political philosophy, but as an enduring and disruptive force, one that remains suspended between dream, impossibility, and irrepressible demand for something otherwise. Nicolas, it's good to see you on camera today.
Thank you very much, Ray, for these kind words of introduction, and good to see you and all of you here online.
Could you just say a little bit more about your work and maybe what got you to put this particular essay together?
Sure. I've been doing a lot of work on, obviously French philosophy, Levinas, and the development of how in French philosophical tradition in the 20th century, there are sort of currents of sort of, let's call it anarchist thinking. So anarchism, not simply as a political movement, but as a mode of thinking. And also with that, of course, as a mode of what it is to be a thinker, to be an intellectual. And more recently, I've been interested in how in the Francophone tradition, in the French tradition, the first awareness and development of a critical engagement with colonialism develops, first and foremost, obviously, French colonialism, but in the broader picture, European colonialism. And one of the things that struck me in that regard was the way in which, again, in the French context, it's really not in the institution of philosophy, the discourse of philosophy, that an awareness and critique of colonialism first develops or becomes cultivated, but it's in French anthropology and its interesting intersection with literature and art, and specifically surrealism. So I was interested specifically in the work of Edouard Glissant, who's kind of an iconoclast as a thinker. I mean, in one sense, he's very typically French in the sense that, like Sartre and others, he's a writer, he's a poet, he's a thinker, he's an intellectual. But unlike the mainstream of French thinkers, he, of course, is not strictly speaking from the mainland France. He's from the Caribbean. And so I was interested in the way in which a lot of Glissant's thinking resonates with themes of what I call the anarchist imaginary, as a kind of imaginary geography of thinkers, which not necessarily needs that each of these thinkers identified themselves as such as anarchists, but which, from our perspective as readers, we can sort of place them within this kind of geography of what I'm calling the anarchist imaginary. The other thing that really struck me about Glissant is a lot of his thinking draws and transforms sort of a certain vocabulary of French philosophy And in one sense, it's not only a French obsession, but our obsession, which is the question of otherness and difference. So I was trying to think about how the question of otherness becomes reformulated in Glissant's writings and how that may or may not have a kind of relevant connection with Levinas's thinking, who in one sense has been established as the canonical thinker of otherness. So that's sort of the sense in which I thought there might be something interesting to take two thinkers who, in a sense, don't really have on the surface of it much of a relationship to each other, and to sort of see what kind of intersection can be established by sort of bringing them within the fold of what I've been calling the anarchist imaginary.
I was really excited when you presented this paper to me because I think it really falls in line not only with our personal and political interests on Acid Horizon, but definitely within our research interests as well, as reflected in our first book, Anti-Oculus. And I noticed that your paper begins by exploring the notion of the anarchist imaginary, beginning with, first, Kropotkin's vision of a society organized around mutual aid, solidarity, and this definition that he creates, one that you say kind of evinces this haunting power of anarchism, not only as a political formation, but in its successive iterations, philosophically, ontologically, and so forth. And considering the broad ideas that Kropotkin has possibly seeded in his definition of anarchism, things like destabilizing the absolute sovereignty of the political sphere, or even sovereignty itself, or something like the primacy of the way of relating to others, whether it's human, animal, planetary, through a shared sense of vulnerability. That's something that anarchism is connected to as well. And maybe finally, like one more big idea is the irreducibility of life to totalizing notions of identity. And one of the challenges that we've experienced as researchers and folks active in politics itself, and even with respect to certain episodes that we have put out that have put in opposition political anarchism with ontological anarchism and trying to sort of forge the divide between those two. How does your concept of the anarchist imaginary challenge conventional notions of political realism? Can anarchism ever be realized? If it cannot, then what's its purpose? What's its function? What does it do? And why do you think anarchism continues to be dismissed as either utopian or chaotic amidst that claim?
Yeah, so there's a lot there for us to sort of start discussing. But the basic sort of proposal I have is that, in a sense, what's the easiest thing to do with anarchism is to dismiss it as either something that's fundamentally utopic and ideal and sort of antithetical to reality, that there's a kind of naivete to anarchism, and we'll say a bit more about what I think that means, that it's something fundamentally imaginary or illusionary, or that it's inherently something that would lead to chaos. So there's sort of two ways in which you dismiss anarchism. Either it's a dreamy illusion, and anarchism is really something that is just of the imaginary in that sense. Or if we were able to develop a way of being with one another that was, loosely speaking, anarchist, that it would lead to a kind of chaotic situation. So in a sense, anarchism in the commonsensical way in which we use the term as something which is unruly, chaotic, etc. So the idea was, let's sort of take anarchism seriously as something that is impossible and therefore imaginary, but nonetheless try to think through why something that seems to be totally imaginary nonetheless cannot be so easily dismissed. It always sort of returns in this imaginary sort of condition. So that's what I call the anarchist imaginary. And there, to be more specific, I think that there's at least four main ideas, you might say problems, that define the anarchist imaginary. One would be, and this is in the vocabulary, this emphasis of solidarity, mutuality, etc., that the basic relation that we have to others is one of responsibility. And therefore that what it is to be a self, or what it is to be a subject, is first and foremost not defined by the freedom to do something, to realize my self-interest, to pursue my own goals, but a kind of responsibility that I have to others. Then we can define what is the scope of that other. So this emphasis on responsibility as where freedom has to sort of be anchored. So the idea is that our notion of the self as a free self, as defined by freedom, is always haunted by a kind of responsibility that invests that freedom. So this emphasis on responsibility. The second idea is that part of what this responsibility towards others entails is an avowal of our dependency on others, that, to put it in more sort of elaborate sense, we are not self-created beings, but beings who depend on others to become ourselves, to create ourselves, whether individually or as a community, and that this dependency on others is at the same time a recognition of the vulnerability of others. So that's the second idea of responsibility, as a recognition of vulnerability of otherness and dependency. The third idea, which I think is really central to especially 19th century anarchist thinkers like Proudhon, Kropotkin, etc., is, you might say, the mystification of authority and sovereignty. I mean, how is it that some human beings are able to have authority and power over other human beings, and whether that's something which is, in a sense, natural, that somehow it belongs to the human condition, that there will be those who are gods and master over others, or whether that's actually something that has to be, if you wish, revealed to be not something that it has to be natural or taken for granted. So why is there sovereignty at all, authority at all? And more specifically, in the sense of the state, why should there be a state? Why is it necessary for human beings to have a certain form of organization that revolves around a state? That's sort of the third idea. And then the fourth idea is, what's the nature of the relations we have to others as a problem specifically of language? So one of the things I want to sort of emphasize is that the anarchist imaginary is also an interesting way to think about the centrality of multilingualism. The idea that the relationship to others is also a relationship to language, and that the relationship to others means that the language that I speak, the language in terms of which I understand myself, is not necessarily the language in which others are going to be related to. And of course, that's going to tie to the question of sovereignty. That sovereignty is always a kind of dream of multilingualism that becomes collapsed into monolingualism. So that's the emphasis of the inherently multilingual or pluralistic dimension of the anarchist imaginary. Those are the elements that, in Kropotkin's definition of anarchism in his Encyclopedia Britannica, you see all of these elements, which again seems to be a kind of fantasy, but let's take the impossibility to somehow be the force of something real that always is not so easily dismissed. And so that's what I mean by the anarchist imaginary.
When you talk about Kropotkin's definition of anarchism, you mention anarchism as a heterotopia, as a place that's radically different. I wanted to ask, how does this relate to the concept of utopia? Because when it comes to the idea of being a different place, or the good place, which because the utopian is built up of the U, which could mean nowhere, and also the good place at the same time, no place and good place. How does this relate to the kind of critique of monolingualism? Because what I mean by that is, when we think of utopias, sometimes thinking about some of the English lyrics to the Internationale, it's about uniting the human race, the idea of utopia as an all people are one kind of situation. Would you say that there's a kind of a way in which anarchism unsettles the idea of utopia insofar as it tries to make it not as monolingual, not a situation in which everything is reconciled, but rather everything actually becomes more open because it isn't reconciled, because there are these new relations?
Exactly. So I would say that, maybe the first thing I'll say is, just taking a step back, that as you know, it's Proudhon who coins the term anarchism and differentiates that from the way in which classical writers, going back to Aristotle, Plato, think of anarchy. So anarchy, in the traditional philosophical vocabulary, going back to the ancients of the Greeks, is a term for the absence of order, the absence of stability and chaos. And it's in Proudhon, anarchism is a positive concept. So it's not the absence of order, but it's trying to imagine a new form of order, a new form of community based on solidarity, mutuality, etc. And Proudhon and other 19th century anarchist thinkers, including, I think, Kropotkin, are actually utopist in that sense. Like, they have this idea that there is some positive articulation of what a community should be like, absence of the state, based on a kind of federation of powers, absence of coercion. And then they imagine a certain perfected form of human existence, communal existence, under the influence of Rousseau. And in that sense, they are classical utopic thinkers because there's a positive model of what that humanity, solidarity as a society should look like. So they're still beholden in my thinking to a kind of progressivist perfectionist of the human nature and human history that comes out of the Enlightenment. I'd like to break with that in this regard from that tradition of 19th century anarchist thinkers like Kropotkin, and instead take the idea of heterotopia, just as you sort of delineated it. And there, the idea of a heterotopia also relates to another aspect I want to argue, which defines, if you wish, the anarchist imaginary, and that is the centrality of the problem of the good, the transcendence of the good, and the transcendence of the good as a kind of placeholder that can never be fully filled by a claim of what the good is for us as such. So the good is a kind of empty placeholder that will always destabilize and decenter any final pronouncement about what is the ideal or perfect way in which we as a community should exist. And that's where the element of language, in the same way that a language is a kind of unity of speakers that is always centered around the absence of a final totalizing unity of the language itself, insofar that language is always evolving and changing as a function of the performance of those speakers within a language. So that's a sense in which our heterotopia is going to be a kind of a world in which the sense of what it is to be unified is always missing, in the sense that it's never fully claimed by any one group or any one linguistic group or individual. And that's a sense in which it is a heterotopia. It also means that it avoids the overly spatialized sense of utopia as a place or a non-place. I would rather like to think of the anarchist imaginary as a heterotopia, as a structure of time, as a structure of temporality. And that, again, is patterned on the us as speakers of a language and us as speakers of many languages, not only natural languages, but the languages of art, the languages of philosophy. So language not simply as a natural language category.
I think the notion of heterotopia is a really interesting one, especially given the fact that, your project is not entirely dissimilar to other ones that are occurring with thinkers like Catherine Malabou, who are taking up an entirely different set of French and German philosophers of the mid to late 20th century, like Foucault, Agamben, who's kind of honorarily French, Sherman, and others. But your inclusion of heterotopia, which really comes out of Foucault's work on language, and it's not really until later that he's able to fold this into articulations of the prison, of the asylum, of ways in which formal relations find themselves in ultimately their other. The whole point of the heterotopia for Foucault, once he's able to take general grammar and shift it over to a rearticulation of the notion of space, is that heterotopia functions as a kind of instantiation of the other that within it carries a political promise. And I think that your use of heterotopia and your critique of monolingualism sort of come together and forge finally an account of sovereignty as that which relies on first the assertion of multilingualism as a problem and the sovereign promise of a monolingualism. And we've seen in contemporary, let's say, democratic utopian thinkers like Fred Evans, the notion of the multi-voiced body, which goes all the way back to Hobbes, where the univocity of the sovereign is the promising element, or say Michael Hart's insertion of the multitude. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how your critique of monolingualism links up to and kind of presses against some of the utopian tendencies in contemporary negriism, in these new forms of like post-Euro communism, these ideas of a entirely unified political field that is unified not just in the fact that we all participate in a mode of production, but in fact that we all participate in a language. And A, sort of what are some of the problems that you think that this kind of theoretical framework has? And B, when you combine your critique of monolingualism with your insertion of the heterotopia, what is a way out from this kind of utopian thinking? And not utopian thinking in the sort of Marxist critique of utopian thinking, but the actual like horrific elements of utopian thinking.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, there's a lot there to talk about and discuss. I mean, maybe just as a start, I would sort of identify sort of three aspects of, let's call it the aspiration for heterotopia, multilingual kind of project. One, I would emphasize at the level of institutions, that in a democratic society, and clearly what I'm trying to do is sort of rethink the democratic space or democracy through this notion of the anarchist imaginary, where, one way to think about it is democracy is always the project of keeping the space of sovereignty radically open to a future other than whoever is occupying the place of sovereignty in the present or today. So the kind of openness of sovereignty as such. At the level of institution, what that means more concretely is that one always has to discover new forms of institutions in order to develop new forms of political ways of addressing problems that we collectively have somehow to deal with. So if we think about, what is the political domain? The political domain is a collection of individuals who are in trying to solve certain kinds of problems that have to be solved in order to maintain a shared life world. And institutions have the primary purpose of sort of proposing solutions to these problems and then regulating them. And so what heterotopia is the attempt to always need to think new forms of institutions in order to deal with these ongoing problems that we face as a society as such. So let me be more concrete. I think one could argue that no political or social institution in our society today as an institution, whether it's universities, the government, corporations, and is the institution which is able to deal with environmental and ecological problems. And so the fundamental challenge that we have as a society is to, in a sense, develop new forms of institutions which are able to deal with these problems, institutions which, in a sense, we don't yet know how to imagine, because it's not corporations, it's not government, it's not the military, it's not the church. I mean, these are the major institutions. And so that's the sense in which heterotopia is the becoming other of institutions, to develop other kinds of institutions that will allow us to deal with the various kinds of problems that we collectively have to face. So that's at the level of institutions. What kinds of institutions do we have to imagine and create in order to address certain kinds of problems? In this case, the environmental problems that threaten and endanger our life world. So that's at the level of institutions. And there is, one could see that right now what's going on in the United States is the collapse of institutions to one institution. That, the American system, which, one of the elements of genius, if you wish, of the American system is that there is no perfect solution to the problem of government. And traditionally, it's, is it democracy? Is it some sort of oligarchy? Or is it some kind of kingship or authoritarian? And the American system tries to say all three are imperfect. And so let's bring the three together into one. So we have the legislative, which represents the democratic element. We have the executive, which represents the idea of a king, the idea of an authority. And then we have the judicial, which represents a kind of elite, a kind of oligarchy. So rather than find one institution that will unify the political space, we have three. And I would say that what's going on now is you have the collapse of two into one. As far as I can tell, the legislative is completely destroyed. There is no power or voice of the legislative. And now you have the pure affirmation of the executive that is also trying to dismantle the juridical. So that's a sense in which, in one sense, authoritarianism in its own perverse way is a kind of utopic movement. it's a utopic movement because it's the attempt to collapse the political into one institution, the institution of the tyrant, of the authoritarian, at the expense of others. And it's also a radical foreclosure that there could be another kind of institution that would be the institution of the sovereign. So in that sense, it's, authoritarianism is fundamentally narcissistic in that regard. So that's, to be a bit more concrete about the heterotopic movement, is the plurality of institutions that would claim and be the institutions of something like sovereignty and authority. And that's, of course, then tied to language itself, because again, then there's going to be not a monolingualism and that's the sense of different voices, etc. And for me, it's not simply different voices, but it's different languages. Because the problem I have with the idea of different voices is you can have different voices, but they're all within the same grammar. They're all within the same language. And this is where I found the idea in Edward Glissant, what Glissant calls the right to opacity, interesting, that, that in a sense, there's a certain right, if you wish, to not being understood and not having to make myself understood. And increasingly, the demand of multilingualism, and that's my problem with utopic, is we all have to be understood. We all have to sort of be transparent in pursuit of this idea that we can all live as a community. And indeed, that we all have to participate in the project of being together. But in my notion of the heterotopia of the anarchist imaginary, there's going to be something important about not having to explain myself, not having to need to be understood, and also not wanting to participate. So this would be the idea that why does one always need to participate in the political? Is the political the fundamental mode of what it is for me to be with other human beings in collectively? So I think that part of what a kind of anarchist democratic ideal should emphasize is being the bad citizen, being the one who doesn't really need to participate in politics, but rather wants to participate in other modes of what it is to enter into relations with other human beings, other kinds of communities. So that would be the sense of which the idea of multilingualism. And then the third idea of, again, sort of a kind of leveraging a critique of the hegemonic tendency of utopias, both utopias of the left and utopias of the right, if you wish, in that regard, comes back to the thing I really want to emphasize, that the anarchist imaginary is centered on, to use this formulation, this transcendence of the good, that the sense of what is good for us as human beings is always haunted by its own emptiness, that it's a kind of empty placeholder that on the one hand we always fill through a certain claim of what we think is good, but always we fill, if you wish, knowing that that aspect of filling it is always sort of leaving something which is unfilled and yet to be filled. And so there is no final pronouncement, if you wish, of what is good for us. And therefore, there is no final pronouncement about who we are as us. And that would be another aspect of, what I'm calling heterotopia.
One of the more fascinating aspects of the anarchist imaginary, and one of the more striking elements of your argument, is the idea that anarchism also can manifest as a kind of ethics of reading. And as you say, it's an approach that avoids mastery, ideological subsumption, or prosecutorial correction. And right away, I think this is just an eminently practical grab from this theory, and something that I think is, I would say, even urgent and necessary amongst communities where philosophy has become important outside of the academy, like in online spaces. One of the things that we run up against time and again is, how do we read certain thinkers who stand outside of a particular political lineage or tradition and read them into that tradition? And right away, I'm thinking of concepts like the hermeneutics of innocence or the hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of innocence, for example, if there's somebody from a particular political tendency or lineage who has a theory that has a really exciting ethics or ontology, but a particularly deplorable or detestable politics, well, we can just grab a little bit from that and bring it over into our theory. And then on the other side of that, there's the hermeneutics of suspicion, which criticizes these attempts as reparative or redemptive readings that inevitably fail to critique the sort of genetic quality of whatever it is they're taking. into their own theory, which would then ultimately infect new concepts that they're attempting to create. In any case, how does the mode of reading in the anarchist imaginary differ from some of the things that I talked about, a hermeneutics of innocence, a hermeneutics of suspicion? And what do you think an ethics of reading in the anarchist sense would reveal about the relationship between theory and praxis?
Yeah, so I mean, the inspiration for that is, this statement, no gods, no masters. And so it struck me at two levels. One is the practice of how, at least in academic discourse, one reads texts, and especially text of the past, especially under the moniker of, the critique of established discourse, Western discourse, etc., really, in my view, often falls to the prey of trying to establish new gods and new masters. So we have to sort of read past authors, past thinkers, in order either to prosecute them or to create a kind of autopsy. On the one hand, they're dead, but we still have to sort of constantly, exhume the dead and understand what it is about them that is not us, that, allowed them not to be us because of their prejudices, their conceits, their blindness, etc., in order to impose ourselves as the masters of discourse. So the idea of an ethics of reading, anarchism as an ethics of reading, is what would it mean to read text and read other authors without subsuming them to a certain kind of mastery, and a mastery which reflects our own conceit of our own presentism. And so, of course, there's an institutional aspect to that, because in academia, I think, strategies of reading are always sort of covert political strategy of establishing certain fields and certain authors as now the dominant authors or the dominant fields. And this obviously also connects to job placement, et cetera, et cetera. So, these are the fields that now have to be established in which then there will be jobs. And therefore, there needs to be a kind of discourse of legitimation for that institutional changing of the arrangement of how knowledge is distributed and classified. And also the sense that somehow that the authors of the past and the texts that they've written are somehow transparent to us. So this goes back to what we were saying earlier, this opacity that otherness has, which is the opacity not to be understood, where not understanding is not a kind of failure or a kind of stubbornness, but it is the mark of what it is to encounter something other and be forced ourselves to think otherwise than ourselves. So rather than, in a sense, judge the past as they were not able to think other than themselves, let's read the past as a way to confront what we ourselves cannot think about ourselves. And in a sense, let's sort of look at the past as a way to think what is unthought about us, rather than always exposing the unthought of the past. So that would be one way to think about the idea of an ethics of reading. And another aspect is something that, I think it's important that when we read other texts, there's a kind of generosity in what we read. Something is given to us, which may or may not be something that the author intended, but which we ourselves can create. So the idea that an ethics of reading as an ethics of the imaginary or imaginary anarchism is really the encounter with a text that creates something new and creates something other than either what we find in the text and within ourselves. So that goes back to creating a kind of new praxis of reading that is open to producing something different than what we ourselves expected and what we ourselves expected to have expected in what we are reading. And that's the sense in which, again, so much of academic discourse is to establish new gods, new masters. And so what would it be to have an academic way that would, if you wish, deinstitutionalize texts and deinstitutionalize thinking? And that's where I would say, I know Craig and I, we've had many discussions about this, where online spaces, I think, are spaces for the deinstitutionalization of texts. And the deinstitutionalization of modes of reading, because they are, first of all, spaces that don't inhabit and don't really have a home in traditional academic texts, academic institutions, but it's also a way in which individuals can come together and encounter each other and sort of confront each other in a ways that creates then different modes of discourse and different modes of understanding.
I think part of what you're pointing at to here is as well, I mean, it's going to force us to confront what we call the history of philosophy, which is this kind of remarkable institution that becomes further and further entrenched as the quote unquote humanities become more and more under siege. I think it's a vitally contemporary question, especially since we just spoke about Peter Thiel on this podcast, and he's been talking about the need to return to a kind of an aristocracy of elite education. But what he means really is like the flimsiest of St. John's great books educations, which of course are like they're decent introductions to these things, but they fail as an educational tool ultimately. I'm wondering when you say sort of no gods, no masters, it's also going to force us to have to take a kind of different perspective on not just the history of philosophy, but like the force of thought. We're going to have to escape again, because I have to get my Hegel knock in, the Hegelian conception of the history of philosophy as the march of a kind of philosophical spirit, and sort of forcefully, positively insert a kind of contingency into everything. I do have a question, though, about sort of the hermeneutic gesture that you're suggesting here when it comes to looking for the unthought of the present. Because you're right, in the history of philosophy, there is this attempt at understanding the history of critique as a successive identification of limits, right? When you say, instead of engaging in that sort of critique, looking at what is unthought in the present that might be lost to us now, but present there, what might that look like? I'm thinking of particular thinkers in the history of philosophy who have tried and with limited success to do this, right? Some of them being thinkers like Heidegger, who think about sort of the impossibility of sort of acquiring these things, or maybe Foucault's History of Madness, right, when we've lost that experience of madness, and of course Rainer Sherman again. What might that look like at the level of engaging with just a book or a thinker? What might my comportment as a reader look like when I'm trying to engage with philosophy in that way?
Maybe in a very straightforward way, in the context of education or teaching, let's imagine that a book is a book is a language, its own language. Obviously, it's a complicated notion of language because a book is not only written in a language, but it uses vocabulary that has a tradition, that has a certain meaning. But let's imagine that we think of books as a kind of language in which we have to translate ourselves. In the same way that when I learn a language, let's say I'm trying to learn Chinese, Mandarin, the only way to learn a language is to lose myself in that language and then find myself again in it by learning it. Because I don't learn Mandarin by speaking English. I learn it by, in a sense, translating and abandoning English and finding myself and how to articulate myself in a different language. So that would be one way in which, rather than teaching the great books as, these are books that teach us how to live, or they have some sort of, cultural value because they're attached to proper names. What would it mean to say you have to understand yourself in the terms of this book? You have to find yourself in that book. And that's a sense in which you have to translate yourself out of the present and almost out of our own illiteracy, because the other thing that I'm sort of, concerned about is the growing illiteralization. I mean, we are becoming completely illiterate as a culture. And that is another way to think about the destruction of multilingualism is as a destruction of literacy. And in the political discourse, I mean, it's to the point where it really is the triumph of complete illiteracy and the attack on institutions of literacy, whether it's science, higher education, universities, etc. So to be very specific, the idea is when I read, whomever, that in almost like in the classroom, that you sort of, encourage students to learn to speak that language, not to parrot it, but like you would learn any language, in order now that you can express and discover and realize your own thinking in that language. So if I'm learning a foreign language like Mandarin, what it is to be a speaker of Mandarin is not to parrot and say what everyone else says in Mandarin, but it's now to use that language in order to express myself and think myself and articulate myself. So that would be one way in which then what we are trying to do in reading the history of philosophy is to translate and to continually translate from one language to another, whether it's Hegel, Kant, etc. And then I would say that the history of philosophy is also kind of a fiction, and that was sort of what I was trying to do with the Glissant Levinas piece, that it doesn't exist in isolation. I mean, the history of philosophy doesn't exist in isolation as a history. It's always in a much more complicated relationship with literary texts, with poetry, with political discourse. So, one of the things I tried to show with someone like Glissant is you can't really place him in the history of philosophy squarely because, surrealism, anthropology. So there's a kind of fiction, and that's the problem I have with the great books. It's a kind of, in a sense, it's a utopic idea that there is a canon of individuals who belong to something called philosophy that's separate and distinct from anthropology literature. And that's going to be highly contingent, that the way in which, in the French context, in the 1930s, Bataille, whomever, Sartre, Michel Derrida, I mean, are they philosophers? Yes, but they're reading anthropology, they're reading psychoanalysis. Obviously, that configuration is going to be different than 1800 Jena, where they're maybe it's not anthropology, but it's poetry. It's Goethe looking at plants and botany. So that would be another example of dismantling the fiction of the history of philosophy as a way of opening up text to what I call their multilingualism.
There's something kind of malignant, though, that you're pointing out here about the history of philosophy, is that it's an imposition of a kind of immanence. It's like, oh, you're in this world, right?
Exactly.
What's so sort of sickening about the way you're describing it, and that I really like, is that it's sort of giving you this false notion of a story that you're a part of, that you're just lightly walking along. But in doing so, right, there are these blinders that are placed. And I think it what your project also does is it forces us to take to task sort of two things, both of which I think Craig could do a better job of talking about than I can: pedagogy and hermeneutics, both of which have to change. And I think Craig could probably speak to that moment in the book Difference in Repetition, right, where Deleuze criticizes pedagogy, and he sort of, he'll take it up again when he talks about order words, but he talks about the difference between a bare repetition and this notion of the swimmer, because no one is going to be able to withstand the tide the same way as their instructor, but you're both in the water. But to simply smack the hands of the swimmer until, of course, their stroke looks exactly the same is going to ensure that you have a lot of drowning proteges. So I think that you open up a lot of really, really interesting pathways here that are not just about reading, but are also bringing down a lot of other things to for lack of better word, to earth. And I think for that reason, I really appreciate sort of what you're doing here, because it's a humble gesture at first. Right, it's a pretty humble gesture at first, but what its implications are quite massive.
Yeah, and then this, what I was writing about, Glissant and Levinas. Let's not think of the and as a zero-sum game. X has won over Y. We need Glissant to correct Levinas's prejudices or mistakes or what have you. And there, the idea is the and is really a movement through. So to take your image or your Deleuzian idea of a swimmer is that when we read text, we're going through them. And the question is, where do we want to go through them? So we don't want to arrive at them, so to speak. So it's not nostalgia or dogmatic insistence that Hegel was right or Heidegger was right. It's that from our position today, we need to read as many authors and diversely as possible, because we need as many channels to go through, to go wherever we need to go from the point of view of the present, which is precisely to exit the present, so to speak. So you can think of reading authors of the past as really opening futures for us, not futures for them, but futures for us. And I think I would argue that that's really how Deleuze reads Grotius and Spinoza, at the time, who were sort of authors who were sort of considered not part of the official history of philosophy. They don't fit into Heidegger's narrative of the history of metaphysics. But let me read Spinoza to go through Spinoza, to go to a future. And that's the sense in which I would say that's what I mean by an anarchist ethics of reading, which avoids the zero-sum game of winners and losers. So another way to state no gods, no master is that there are no winners and there are no losers in the history of philosophy. And that's also, as you can probably notice, my indirect critique of a lot of post-colonial discourse, critical philosophy of race, that somehow we can categorically make judgments about past authors that they failed because of X, Y, and Z, and we are here to redeem their failure. So, we're not here to redeem the past, and we're not here to pronounce the truth about the past. And if there are authors that for whatever reason are no longer channels or conduits for us to escape our present to the future, then just don't read them. Like, you don't need another PhD on Hegel and race. Like, if that's not going anywhere, then just don't read. So I think there's a kind of morbid, almost necrotic fascination with living and feeding off the dead, which I think is really telling us more about ourselves, that we are sort of, academically, we are zombies. There's nothing really vital. There's really no future for us. And so we constantly have to live off the corpses of the dead, the corpses of the past, to create the illusion of life. But actually, we're just zombies.
Yeah, I appreciate that critique of sort of the zombification of certain thinkers. I mean, as somebody sort of wrote a lot about Stirner and the sort of question of whether Stirner is this secret Hegelian or is he a secret Spinozist or whatever. The sort of the way in which we have to sort of turn dead philosophers into a kind of proletarian for our own kind of self-affirmation can be quite jarring at times. And I just wanted to bring up another thing though regarding this intersection between this fusion I mean of Glissant and Levinas. I mean, one of the thinkers as well you cite a lot is Derrida, and Derrida, when he talks about the relationship to the other, he also talks about the dual root of the word hospitality, of hostility and hospitality. The idea of hospitality is a kind of guest right, and so in hospitality you have to owe the person the privilege of being a guest. But at the same time, when you receive them, you're also forcing them into a position of guest in which they have to be a good guest. And there's certain rules of expectations of being a good guest that may be imposed on them by the very fact that you receive them, and they may not want to be received. And to that extent, I want to ask if we can unpack a bit this relationship to opacity and the other, in the way how it tries to get out of the ways in which our attempts at hospitality sometimes can be quite hostile because they demand that the other be understood. It's thinking about, the recent, obviously, the changing of the official language of the United States into English from there not being one. And of course, the hostility of if you are received as a guest functionally in the US, TSA, ICE will treat you that the way in which their hospitality is also fundamentally hostile.
No, you're absolutely right. That I mean, one way to interpret what this idea of the right of opacity means is, in a sense, that the guests that we bring into our home, in one sense, is a kind of gesture of hospitality, but it's always under the demand of domestication, to render the other domesticated to our form of life, to our language, etc. And that would be to render the other fully transparent and to deny the opacity of. So in a sense, to deny that what it is to be hospitable is to allow the unruliness of the guest. And that the unruliness of the guest would not be antithetical to our hospitality, but would be the very condition for hospitality. And I think you're absolutely right, Adam, that, it's very extremely violent reaction against immigrants and others, et cetera, under this kind of dual mode of it's not a violence that we are imposing on them. It's an violence that they are imposing on us that we have to protect ourselves against. And that this is, in a sense, a way in which we can have it both ways. We can remain hospitable while justifying being inhospitable, in fact, to the point of being inhuman. And that is a sense in which, of course, what it threatens there is, again, the monolingualism of ourselves and this claim to a kind of, possession of space and territory and language that is our possession, which, and in a sense, obfuscates within what I'm calling the anarchist imaginary, the fundamental position of responsibility towards otherness and for otherness. And here I'd like to also connect it to something which is part of what hospitality is about giving gifts to the other, and giving gifts to the other where there's no demand of reciprocation. So it's not, well, I'll give you something if I get some, okay, we'll take these immigrants if they work. Or if they, this idea that the gift to the guest is always under the imposition of a kind of reciprocity, that then I need or we need something in return, that has to be a relationship of direct reciprocity, instead of what I would sort of propose is a kind of a notion of indirect reciprocity, that the reason why I give to the other who needs something is because someone in the past has already given to me. That if others had not given something to me, then I wouldn't be in the position that I am, and therefore I give to others not under the expectation that they give in return, but because giving to the other for what they need is me giving in turn, given that someone has given to me. So this is the idea of what the French anthropologist who was an anarchist in thinking, Marcel Mauss, calls indirect reciprocity. That we give to the future as an expression of gratitude to the past that has given to us. And so I think that this notion of indirect reciprocity is a way to rethink hospitality. And in that sense, the anarchism, the anarchist imaginary, and this is something that Saul Newman has developed as well, Derrida, is fundamentally a kind of ethics of hospitality. But the ethics of hospitality that is not bound to the double bind of reciprocity, which I think is what Derrida traces the ambiguity in hospitality of you are welcomed if you allow to take the place that I assign to you, then that's precisely a question of reciprocity. And so to break that hospitality and make it in terms of indirect reciprocity.
Could I actually pick up something on that? When you talk about the idea of we're giving something to the other because I have been a receiver of many gifts, I have been a receiver of help, and therefore I help other people without expectation of return. That's really because that's the same argument that Kant gives in the Second Critique. Because he's like, he says there's a contradiction in the will if I say I'm never going to help anyone. I can't universalize that because I too need help. And in terms of does to that extent, that cause it's a very universal argument. It's an argument that sort of, in a way, at least in Kant's terms, wants to say that if you want to never help anyone, you end up contradicting yourself because you therefore need it. Your root of your willing capacity to will or is based in that. And so when it comes to this hospitality, then does it become a kind of universal in that sense, or does it have to change what we mean by what universal is in order to fit it in this anarchist form? Because I'm not saying you're doing sort of a Kantian thing in terms of this is like a new moral law, but how does that change relationship to what we might think of as moral laws or moral universality?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here I'm just going to sort of endorse and reformulate Marcel Mauss's argument in The Gift, where he argues that one of the fundamental structures of human societies is what he calls indirect reciprocity. And he develops his notion of indirect reciprocity in his book on The Gift as a way between the lines, because it's not emphatic, as a critique of liberal utilitarian societies that understands gift giving fundamentally as a problem of reciprocity, where I have something that's in my possession and I give it to another in exchange for something, for money or what have you. And so that's where you have individuals who are defined by freedom, and the fundamental manifestation of freedom is private property and possession. And then the question is, there's a rationality and therefore a measure to the exchange of objects, whether that's through economic exchange or saying thank you or what have you. And that's so bilateral direct reciprocity. And I think Kant's conception is really within that model. Indirect reciprocity for Mauss, and of course Mauss then draws examples and is inspired by non-Western cultures, what he calls archaic cultures for that, is precisely where the objects, if you wish, that are involved in gift giving are not fully in my possession. So for example, natural resources that we have extracted from nature are not objects that are fully in our possession because they are from nature. And so that would be an example of how the object always has this otherness within it that is that exceeds my possession. And therefore, when I give it to another, when I sell it, for example, to you, I take oil and I sell it, in a sense, what I'm selling is not something that is fundamentally mine at all. And therefore, what right do I have to sell it to you in that regard? So that's a sense in which then indirect reciprocity for most involves three parties, which are not all contemporaneous with each other, and possessions that, in a sense, nobody owns fundamentally. And so the sense is that because I would not exist without others having given, and not simply out of need or help, but just given in whatever sense, beginning with very material language, resources, etc., that therefore there is a kind of obligation imposed by those things that are given to me, which are not really the possessions to have been given, that I then give in turn. And to put it maybe more pragmatically, I mean, Craig had asked earlier, like, how does one think of the anarchist imaginary as a thinking of hospitality in terms of what I would call endowment and entrustment? That, for me to at all exist, I have been endowed in a certain way by others, by my culture, by my community, etc. And therefore, this endowment is also entrusting me to endow the future. So what does that mean more practically? I would give two examples. One is going back to what we said earlier, ecological and environmental concerns. That, we have a kind of responsibility to ensure that the world is a place of hospitality for the future, a future without us. So that's a sense in which, how can we be hospitable for others in a world in which we ourselves are not present? That is to be responsible to ensure that worlds of the future will not be contaminated and polluted as the cost for the benefits that we have accrued today. So part of the idea of hospitality is hospitality for those who are yet to come in a world in which we are no longer. So it's not simply hospitality for others in our present. It's how can we allow there to be hospitality in the future for those who are yet to come in a world in which we are no longer. That would be a structure of indirect reciprocity or intergenerational hospitality. And another example to make it a bit more concrete in terms of the practical aspect is, I think what we would all agree what we are witnessing now with Elon Musk and Trump and these techno billionaires, et cetera, is this idea that we are self-made men, we've made billions, and we fundamentally owe nothing to anyone. That somehow, if we were, the sacred principle in our society is that you cannot tax the rich. That somehow, if an individual through their own, self-realization has accrued billions, that somehow it's fundamentally immoral and unethical to place a limit on how much wealth one human being can accrue. But clearly, we as a society place limits on all sorts of things that I want. I can't drink as much alcohol as I want. I can't take as much drugs as I want. So why do we think that we can't place a limit on wealth? I think because we have this myth that the individual is this freedom who is fundamentally not haunted by responsibility. And in a sense, it's the complete destruction of indirect reciprocity. The only kind of reciprocity that we accept is direct reciprocity. And therefore to say, well, look, if you have billions, then there's a kind of responsibility that you have to society. And Trump is a great example. I mean, clearly, because his father gave him money, because he existed in a world in which he could be endowed in a way that allowed him to be Trump, he can be Trump. So precisely the person who is incapable of giving himself anything, who literally was fed from a silver spoon, then has to fundamentally deny that kind of endowment and is entrusting nothing to the future. And that's why it's a kind of absolute collapse of the future into an absolutely, narcissistic present. It's the utopia of himself. So that would be an example of how, not surprisingly, Trump is the demon of hospitality. And you saw that at the White House with Zelensky. I mean, the brutality of that is precisely, the radical rejection of any kind of hospitality under the pretense of we are self-made men with our ties and our suits and our power, etc. That's what the anarchist imaginary, first and foremost, is going to expose as the lie and the hypocrisy. The fiction that sovereignty is, and the perversity of that kind of sovereignty. The question of hospitality, very much in the lines that you suggested, Adam, with Derrida and others. Saul Newman also has, I think, really articulated anarchism as an ethics of hospitality, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
His essay called Max Stern and the Ethics of Involuntary Servitude, I recommend everyone go and check that out.
It's
very good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nicola. Maybe just one question to kind of wrap us up and bring the end of the discussion right back to the beginning, talking about the prospects of the political realism of anarchism. I mean, at least one of the seemingly positive aspects of the program suggested within your concept of the anarchist imaginary is this notion of a heterotopia, a sense in which there are many institutions, and we evacuate the notion of institution to which we are tethered to these organs via infinite forms of debt. The state will never die, the church will never die, and so forth. How do we then go about achieving these aims, whether we call them anarchism or not, in establishing something else, something otherwise, whether it's an institution in the sense of the heterotopic many institutions, or just a complete destitution of those existing institutions? One of the challenges that I see is, how does an institution that subsists in the logic of endowment, in the logic of hospitality, override and overcome a world rife with institutions bound to this other logic of infinite debt and, individualism and the narcissism that you're perceiving as emanating from them?
Part of what we have to accept with the plausibility of the anarchist imaginary is the challenge of imagining what other kinds of institutions need to be created, and what it takes to create new kinds of institutions to, as I said, allow us to collectively deal with various kinds of problems and issues that are issues that we need to deal with in order to maintain certain kinds of life worlds, certain forms of life. And there, one of the problems is that institutions don't want to die. They are a kind of way in which human beings produce socially a kind of immortality. So one question would be, institutions have to learn how to die. And how do we, and here, this is a bit different than, in one sense, I would say in the Marxist tradition and then certain anarchist traditions, especially in the 19th century, institutions don't die, they have to be killed, they have to be destroyed. But I'd like to propose, rather than destroying institutions, we have to sort of educate them to die. There has to be kind of euthanasia of institutions. So it's not, taking over institutions or resisting institutions. It's how do we introduce a kind of pedagogy of institutions dying and learning how to die and learning that their time is now up, so to speak. And that requires then us creating and imagining new forms of institutions that would displace and absorb the remains of these institutions that have to die. So I know that's still sort of a vague thing, but rather than, either we take over the institutions and we have, the dictatorship of the proletariat, or we just resist these institutions, let's, in a sense, inhabit institutions and be the caretakers of their death, so to speak. So here I would say political institutions, the Democratic Party is a zombie, and the Republican Party has become a monster, right? So, one is undead and one is just a monstrosity. So the idea would be, how do we enter political parties and sort of almost curate their extinction as a way to give rise to new forms of parties and even a new idea of what it is to have an identity as political. So, what does it mean to be? Why does, in our society in the US, it's either you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, but I think are now meaningless terms anyway. Maybe there's new ways of political identification and political parties and institutions. And then going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think here the idea of pedagogy and education, that I think that, maybe I shouldn't say this too loudly because I don't want to sound like a hypocrite being an employee of a university, but there is something fundamentally undead about humanities. I mean, everyone is, trying to find some justification for why there should be humanities in universities. And it's either some moral argument that it's good to improve the moral character of students, or it's, well, we can, job placement, we can get these people jobs, and therefore that's why we should have, a PhD program in whatever. So you can also see that there is a kind of sense in which no one really knows why we have institutions that teach texts. And increasingly, I would say with AI and ChatGPT, that's going to accelerate the kind of, legitimation crisis of the institution of humanities. And that can be an opportunity to reimagine, reinstitutionalize what it is to read others, what it is to have discussion about ideas and what have you. And that's part of the heterotopic production of a future. So another way to think about, heterotopia, it's, going back to something that I know is important for many of us here, this Mark Fisher idea that, we exist in a world in which there is no future, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And this is sort of the cancellation of the future. I think the anarchist imaginary and heterotopia is a kind of call to imagine new futures and to begin that call at the place where we ourselves inhabit, which is reading text, reading books, reading texts, writing texts. And that is a kind of pedagogy of a future which has to be imagined and reimagined. And that would be a sense of new institutions and new practices of reading and encountering each other, where, and I know I'm probably here speaking to, to a convinced crowd, that's where things like the internet, has a kind of promise, not a promise of revolution or resistance, because I think that's too lofty, but the promise of new forms of being in communities with others and developing what I'm calling anarchist ethics of reading, of no gods, no masters.
Maybe just one quick follow-up to that, and I know this is something that we've discussed in the past. It seems the deeper implications of what you're putting forward here is that those of us who are graduate students, those of us who are lecturers or tenured faculty, are presented with a kind of ethical quandary then. If we are to engender the anarchist imaginary, and its full ethical thrust, how is it then that we then become the caretakers that you're talking about? And maybe what we're doing now is an instantiation of the very ethics that you're putting forward here, as a representative of the university working with us in this online space. Are there any sort of further practical points or ideas or intimations of what that might look like if this idea of an anarchist imaginary and all of its ethics were to flower even further?
In the sense of sort of non-institutional spaces?
Yeah.
In one sense, it's not to make this a cop-up, but what's imaginary about anarchism is also a problem of time. What is the proper expectation that we should have to change the world, just to put it very bluntly? And in a sense, maybe the expectation is, as I was saying earlier, to sort of create different forms of community and relations with others, which aren't necessarily housed or structured by established institutions. And that's where then we can develop sort of anarchist cultivation of encounters. And what is the place in which we encounter and cultivate that? Well, we encounter it in the space of discourse of, talking about this, let's talk about the Lewis. It doesn't matter what author, but so texts now become places of encounter where we encounter each other. And I'll give you one example to make it a bit more concrete. So, I've been in Hong Kong now for the past few months. And so there are many students from mainland China who are here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And, I have these really very impressive moments where a student who comes from a very remote region in China is telling me, they read, they read Guy Debord, Society of Spectacle. So somewhere in China, someone's reading Guy Debord, or they've read whatever, Deleuze or Levinas. And so that's a sense in which, one can meet individuals and find spaces to cultivate almost at the micro level, these encounters. And that's already something. That's already something. If there are people in China or in the US and they're in their dark corners reading text or thinking about things, and to increase the channels in which we can meet each other globally, and that's where, again, the internet, I think, is a space for that. That would be an example of what is the cultivation of these anarchist spaces and let's maybe not even call them anarchist spaces, because, anarchists are such a pejorative meaning in the popular culture. Let's just return to cultivation. Let's cultivate thinking, because I think we're in that situation now where, it's, the age of unthinking and the triumph of unthinking and illiteracy. So maybe another way to think about it is, what I'm really trying to say is the anarchist imaginary as a heterotopia of multilingualism. The challenge is to maintain and cultivate literacy and different forms of literacy in philosophy, in political thinking, in music, in the arts, because I think we are undergoing a massive crisis of illiteracy.
And I hope that over the next few months, once you return to the United States, that we can extend our ongoing collaboration, as Acid Horizon will have a residency at a space in State College for 2 months, where we'll be conducting philosophy workshops, public philosophy seminars. I will be launching my I Ching / psychogeography oracle as a way for people to be more creative in their lives. And there's going to be a whole lot happening at that time. And hopefully, as we discussed, Nicolas, this concept of the anarchist imaginary, or this paper itself, might develop into an actual book, which maybe we will release on our own impending imprint called Ocular Editions, which we will release the Acephalous Tarot, and I will release my psychogeography deck, and hopefully a few more titles that we've curated from around the internet and in spaces that we operate within. Is there a chance that you will continue this particular line of research? And have you been thinking about the book proposal that we discussed earlier?
Yeah, so I've been given, the idea was it was a kind of a hunch that became a bit more than a hunch and then became something of a paper. But I'd like to, pursue and develop this idea of, what I'm calling the anarchist imaginary, not only through, let's call it, the thinkers and figures that people like Catherine Malabou and others have cultivated, but also through, as we were saying, figures who are not strictly speaking philosophers in the tradition of surrealism, etc. But I think most importantly, I'd like to imagine this idea I have of the anarchist imaginary as a kind of invitation for others to join what I'm calling, a kind of renaissance of literacy, learning to speak other languages other than one's own. And by that, I mean not just natural languages. And in that sense, the plurification of discourses rather than, and part of this is also, we didn't, get into it that much, but it's on the periphery. Increasingly, AI, ChatGPT, that's its own kind of monolingualism that's occurring now. And so I think increasingly, not to sort of demonize it, but to return to what it is to speak in many tongues. And that, I think, is urgently needed, given that, as far as I can say, not only have we reached a point of monolingualism, but we've really reached a point where no one's speaking any language. Politics is devoid of a language. It's just threats and murmurs.
Well, as I understand it, it is now the witching hour in Hong Kong, and you have things to do early in the morning. So I hope to see you back in the United States soon. We'll get together for a coffee once you do.
With pleasure. And thank you to you all. It's really a fascinating discussion. I hope we have opportunity to continue these themes that I know are really important to all of us.
All right. Thank you, Nicolas. Take care.
Thank you.